Welcome to the Living the Dream podcast with Curveball. If you believe, you can achieve. Welcome to the Living the Dream with Curveball podcast, a show where I interview guests that teach, motivate, and inspire. Today, we're going to be talking about the art of persuasion, as I am joined by magazine executive, author, and journalist Jay Heinrichs. Jay has been doing what he does for 25 years, and he fell in love with the forgotten secret of rhetoric and the art of persuasion. So he has a book even called Thank You for Arguing. He has several books on this topic, so we're going to be talking to Jay about his books and the art of persuasion and everything that he's up to and going to be up to. So, Jay, thank you for joining me.
Well, it's a pleasure, Curtis.
Why don't you start off by telling everybody a little bit about yourself?
Well, I first fell in love with this art of persuasion really early in life. I've always been a big reader, and tell you the truth, I wasn't a great student in school. Instead, I just hung out at the library, pulling books down at random and reading them. But all along, I thought words did more than sit around looking pretty. Words have power. People sacrifice their lives to the power of words. People get married by that power, do things they regret next morning, with the same power of words. And I wanted to know what that power was. And, all through school, I kept looking for it. Now, rhetoric, which teaches the power of words, wasn't studied anywhere I went. I went to a good college. I ended up going to grad school briefly before I dropped out. And all along, I didn't know really what rhetoric was. And then one day, I was working as an administrator at Dartmouth College here in New Hampshire, where I live, when I found doing my old habit of pulling books down at random and just opening them, reading them. I found a book by John Quincy Adams, who was not yet president of the United States. He was a U.S. senator when he wrote this book, and it was signed by him. And I'm kind of a history buff, so I thought it was pretty cool that I'm holding a book I just pulled at random by a future president of the United States. And in that book, the first page I read, it was his first lecture to students at Harvard, where he was a temporary professor of rhetoric. And he told these students, who were all pretty much teenagers back then, this is in 1810, to catch from the relics of ancient oratory those unresisted powers which mold the mind of man to the will of the speaker and yield the guidance of the nation to the dominion of the voice. So in other words, he was telling these kids, all boys back then, about the power of words. And I thought, that's it. So the rest of the lectures told me what to read. So I did that, drove my family crazy for the next 20 years. And so I ended up quitting my job as a magazine executive and dedicating my life to teaching the powers of persuasion, which are very important because democracy is based on that power. And whether we save our democracy or not depends on our understanding of that power.
Well, your power of persuasion has got you to advise a lot of clients. So talk about the clients that you have advised throughout the years.
Well, I've had a bunch. So I advise nonprofits, government agencies, corporations, everywhere, everything from airlines to my favorite client of all time, which was NASA. I helped them figure out how to persuade the Pentagon into giving up two MX missiles, ballistic missiles, to send up climate change measuring satellites. Um, it's one of those few times when you really know you've won an argument. A lot of times, people say they agree when they don't in the long run. But you can get two rockets out of the Pentagon, you've won an argument. I also have continuing conversations and consultancies with nonprofit groups who are trying to gather people to make change in a good way. So again, I mean, the thing about argument is, which is my specialty within the art of persuasion, is it has to do with people disagreeing and then finding a way to agree, and that leads to better things for both parties.
Well, I know you've also created your own time zone, daylight savings. Kind of tell us about that. I bet it's better than daylight savings.
It depends who you're talking to and whether you like any kind of nightlife. So my most recent book is Aristotle's Guide to Self-Persuasion, which uses the philosopher's principles, a lot having to do with this crazy book he wrote called On the Soul, in order to make yourself align with your better self, as he puts it, and which is what he considers your soul to be. And so, as part of this, I decided I would try to find this crazy, stupid, pointless goal and see if I could apply the principles of persuasion, of rhetoric, to talk myself into it and then actually do what it took to try to achieve it. And so the goal I ended up choosing was running my age up this classic mountain in New Hampshire where athletes test their fitness because it's the perfect length and elevation gain to test your VO, your ability, your body's ability to process oxygen. And so, but I never was that great an athlete. And to run your age means running up to the top of the mountain in fewer minutes than you're old in years. Now, I had one advantage in that I was going to attempt this when I turned 58 years old. No one over 30 had ever run their age. So I'd be the first ever to do it. The problem was two physiologists had told me they thought this was probably impossible because the combination of strength and power and sort of leaping ability pretty much goes away after a certain age. And I never was that good to start with. So I spent a year. We lost all kinds of income because I just really dedicated myself to this, doing everything I could to try to train for this while talking myself into doing all those things. Now, the first thing I did was I decided I needed to carve the time out. And one way to do that was to find, okay, what's the most useless time of the day for most of us? It's usually the last hour when we're just sort of zoning out, watching, streaming videos, watching TV, whatever. And so I decided I would give up that time and give it to me first thing in the morning. And then I decided I was going to take another hour and do the same thing. So here's a trick that actually you can use if you're willing. And that is to wait until you gain the extra hour. You know, we just lost one with daylight savings. In the fall, we gain an hour. And instead of just sort of sleeping that extra hour, get up as though it's still daylight savings, which is actually an hour early. And that's what I did. So I got up. I'm a fairly early riser because I married an early bird. I'm not by nature. And I was getting up at 6. This time when standard time came around, I got up at 5 o'clock and I did the same thing shortly after that, just killing myself for that extra hour. And now to this day, I get up at 4 o'clock in the morning every morning. Now, instead of telling people I get up at 4 o'clock in the morning, which sounds crazy even to me, I declared my own time zone. I call it J-light savings. So I just get up at a normal time. It just happens to be everybody else's 4 o'clock in the morning. Now, if that sounds completely insane, you have to consider like if you fly to a different time zone, you don't resent the time zone or just stay in the time zone you're in. You adapt. And that's what I decided I was going to do. It's as if, I moved like to the middle of the Atlantic Ocean where the time zone is 2 hours, earlier. And I called it J Light Savings because my name's Jay, and why not? Now, the only problem with that is I mentioned nightlife. You're not going to be a very interesting person after, 8 o'clock, which is when I go to bed. I generally take a book with me. I'll read for half an hour and fall asleep and then nap during the day for half an hour. It's the only way I survived this. But it did help me because I would start working out at 4 o'clock in the morning. Now I start work, I start writing at 4 in the morning, which is a time, by the way, when I'm drinking coffee and not feeling sorry that I'm not playing outside. Like, what else am I going to do but sit in a chair and write?
Well, how can someone persuade themselves to do something like lose weight or gain a healthy habit or something like that?
That's a great question. And there are a bunch of tools that actually came originally from Aristotle, who wrote the first book on rhetoric that survived, and really kind of invented the whole idea of persuasion and self-persuasion. Aristotle was also the original and I think best philosopher of habits. And one of the things that he had a bunch of principles that I sort of boiled down into what I call the lure and the ramp. And the lure is giving yourself a really attractive goal. And it doesn't even have to be one you think is that doable. A lot of the problems with our, say, losing weight is that we set a kind of too modest a goal. Like, I'm going to lose a pound or two without, being vague or whatever. Maybe setting too few metrics. Like maybe you should look at your how well your pants are fitting instead of, what the scale is telling you, that sort of thing. So the lure is the idea that not just you're going to lose a couple pounds, but you're going to be able to climb stairs without gasping or, look great in a bathing suit, your version of great, whatever that might be. Now, the ramp part of it is even more important, which is instead of saying, I'm going to lose weight in time for this wedding so I can fit into this particular dress or suit or whatever in the next 2 weeks, instead say, give yourself a year, like a whole year, and try to reset what you're eating. And that involves a different rhetorical principle, which is this idea of reframing. So you have to change what you're eating to make it disgusting. Like, with eating it, one of the things I love donuts. I love donuts as much as anything in the world. But what I do is I think of how those donuts are created, and you think of how the machines create them, and it's disgusting. And you think about what makes a donut, and you focus on that. It's a way of reframing that. There are a bunch of other tools I use for myself all the time in doing this. Now, all that leads up to this. Habits start slowly. I call this the tortoise method. The slower you start a habit, the better. When I started working out in order to, achieve my goal of running my age up this mountain, I didn't even work out at first. I spent a couple weeks reading books about physiology, which at first seemed really interesting. And after a while, I got really bored reading them to the point where an easy 20-minute exercise, mostly like stretching and doing mild aerobics in front of a, computer monitor, with a workout DVD, actually seemed better than reading these physiology books. And gradually, I just built up 5 minutes more every day, more and more intense exercise. I went outside then and started running, and the rest is history. It actually works because I spent a year. If I tried to do this in a month, I would have killed myself. Now, doctors will do the exact opposite. And I don't blame them because most people really don't change their habits because it's really hard and discouraging. But what doctors will say, I think, is even more discouraging, oftentimes, where they'll say, just walk 10 minutes a day. Won't achieve much, but it's better than nothing. And, people get discouraged with that because they don't see the kinds of results that you might get. On the other hand, if you set this really wild goal, like running up a mountain, the chances are you're going to fail, but you're really going to fail up. You'll still be fitter than you've ever been in your life because of what you did to put into that. And if you get the right kind of attitude, you don't see yourself as a failure. You realize you've done something pretty awesome, which is to gain the habits that you hope you'll maintain the rest of your life. Which I have to say, and don't take this as bragging. I credit Aristotle. I still do the exercise and I'm still in better shape now. And I'm now 70 years old and I'm in better shape than I was when I was 40.
Let's take a quick break.
Hi there. If you would like an instant quote for business insurance, go to insuranceman.net. Protect what you have worked so hard for. Insurance Man LLC. Entrepreneur's best friend.
Well, give us some best practice tips on what we can do to avoid being manipulated by slick persuaders.
So one of the things that Aristotle, I always go back to Aristotle. He's my man. And one of the things that he insisted on was the definitions of things. And this is true of Plato as well. The Greeks were big on the power of words, and the power of words comes to from with how you define them. So look for things that, especially on social media or speeches by politicians, that use pronouns without any antecedents. And by that, I mean when a politician says they, and you're not quite sure who they mean, or when someone says people say, that's not defining who they're talking about. The other thing is when people use terms like weaponize, that's a term you hear all the time, and it really has very vague meaning. Some really nice sounding words like kindness and empathy often are very manipulative because they're not well defined. So that's one thing to look about. That the best thing you can say to yourself or asking other people if they're arguing with you is, what do you mean by that? What do you mean by that word? And then really get them to drill down. That's one thing. The other thing is to look at what the sources are of the information and really query that. A lot of the stuff we see on online, especially now, with all this AI slop that's happening in social media, ask yourself, where's this coming from? Now, a famous rhetorician and orator, Marcus Tullius Cicero in ancient Rome, used this expression cui bono, which means who benefits. So it's the other thing to think about when someone is giving a speech or arguing with you or trying to talk you into something, you ask, who's going to benefit from this? Is it just you? So why should I trust you? There are a bunch of other things you can do, but looking at the source, defining the words, and asking who benefits are three of the most important things you can do to avoid manipulation. And we haven't even gotten into logic, which is a lot more complicated. Those are the simpler ways to do this.
Well, I know that you say framing is the most important part of persuasion. So explain what framing is.
So framing is really fun if you want to manipulate people. This is a dark art, so you have to you hope that you're a good person using it, or I hope everybody who does this will use it for good instead of evil. But to reframe things, I'll give you an example. I often give these video chats for high school classes that adopt my book. They're mostly AP classes. And one time, this young woman said that she had come home the day before, and her big sister was sitting at the kitchen table. And so the girl who was asking the question went to the cabinet and took down some peanut butter and got out some bread and started making herself a sandwich. And big sister says, you're so selfish. You're using up all the peanut butter. I can't believe you're doing that. You've always been like this. You're so selfish. She said, what should I have said? Because she had just the girl just frozen, not knowing what to say and trying not to cry, just being picked on by big sister. And she asked me what to do. And I said, you know, if you really feel like you want to get back at your sister, look really sympathetic. Instead of yelling or looking angry or crying, see if you can do this. Say, what's this really about? And this is reframing. This is the question you ask and reframe. What's this really about? Is this about peanut butter? Or is this about that horrible boyfriend of yours? Are you guys having a problem? And look really sympathetic. Make sure there's a table between you because this could lead to violence. But on the other hand, if you really want to actually reframe things and take it entirely away from peanut butter and direct it back at Big Sister, that's one way to do it. Now, framing or reframing has been used in absolutely brilliant ways. Back in the day, in the early 1960s, this woman, Rachel Carson, who was a scientist, wrote an article for New Yorker magazine that became a best-selling book called Silent Spring. And she was talking about pesticides that were, thinning the eggs of eagles and hawks and other raptors. DDT in particular was doing this. Okay, so that's pretty technical, right? It's pretty specific, but it was a bad thing. I mean, it was killing owls and that sort of, bird species. Well, the term Silent Spring reframed everything to broaden the whole issue. So she was really writing about what chemicals were doing to the environment, but while specifically talking about her area of research, which was thinning bird eggs. Now, you picture this, and this is back in the 60s where you had, Harriet, the housewife, hanging up her laundry and listening for bird calls and not hearing anything. And that's really tragic. Well, this directly led to the environmental movement and the passage of all this legislation that cleaned up water, cleaned the air. Later on, a very famous and now controversial ad showed this man, Iron Eyes Cody, he called himself, who was an actor. And I don't know if you remember this, Curtis, but this was a TV ad that ran repeatedly um, as a public service announcement. And it showed this classic Indian, even though Iron Eyes Cody actually wasn't in India, I think it was an Italian American. Anyway, he showed an Indian with his moccasins, standing by the shores of a water, of a like a lake or a river, and a car goes by and somebody throws litter out and it lands at his feet, and the camera shifts to show all this trash filled water, and a single tear is going down this man's stoical face. um, and that it was an anti-littering ad, but again, that triggered all kinds of legislation. Even though people now push back, and I don't blame them, on this stereotype of like the stoical Indian with a single tear. But that was a kind of reframing too, because if you go back to the peanut butter, what's this really about? Is this about people just tossing something out of cars, or is it about, our indifference toward nature and how important it is to us? And that is, so reframing starts with saying, what's this really about? Then there are other techniques we don't have to go into, because that's the main thing. When you're in an argument, you want to reframe things, say, it's not about this, it's about that. And reset the frame so that it benefits your point of view.
Let's take a quick break.
If you're a pet owner who wants real talk on training, behavior, and everyday life with animals, check out the Fresh Patch Podcast. Hosted by Drew and Gabe, we cover the wins, the challenges, and everything in between. So wherever you listen, search the Fresh Patch Podcast, where good pets get it.
Okay, well, I know in your latest book, you talk about how the ancients invented a special rhythm that advertisers have used to sell junk food. So why would you want to use this rhythm on yourself?
This is the craziest part, because I didn't believe it could possibly work, and it did. And to this day, I still use these things. So let me go back to the very beginning in ancient times, when warriors were going into battle, they would chant a prayer to the god of healing, who is called Paean, Paen, Paean. And they would chant it with a rhythm, and there was a belief that is really carried on almost to this day, over thousands of years, that if you say like a magical spell with a kind of rhythm, it has more power and it works better that way. So basically, these warriors were going to battle yelling, "Please, Pian, don't let me die. Don't let me get hurt." And that turned into a war chant that we call today a slogan. Now, the two are related, paeans and slogans. And so it became from, paean, please don't let me die, it was like into like, let's kill the enemy. Now, fast forward a few thousand years, and um, marketers understand that rhythmic speech can really stick in people's heads better. It's stickier language. And so the snack food industry came up with all kinds of, rhythmic paeans they call slogans. Bet you can't eat just one. The quicker picker upper, if we're talking about Bounty towels. New York Times even got into it with all the news that's fit to print. Now, ancient rhetoricians sort of described how this rhythm works, which even though, ancient Greek and Latin works a lot differently in terms of rhythm from our modern English, but still the principle applies. If you combine short syllables, bop, 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 with long syllables, la, 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 and sort of crisp consonants like p or t with softer consonants like or n, you'll realize if you look at all kinds of advertising expressions called slogans, you'll see the short and long and crisp and soft word sounds coming together in ways that sound like almost poetry. Now, you can see this in hip hop today. A lot of the lyrics of hip hop songs play a lot with that kind of rhythm and the short and long syllables because it's really stickier. So I came up with my own when I was trying to run up a mountain, and and often a good paean also ends on the same words or begins on the same words or both. So I would shout to myself in my head because I was breathing so hard I couldn't say it aloud. My legs love rocks. I follow up rocks. Uh, and to this day, when I wake up first thing in the morning, I give myself a paean and I say, "Make this a glorious day." It's that combination of short and long syllables and different kinds of word sounds. Make this a glorious day. And I do say that aloud as I roll out of bed. Drives my wife crazy. But it makes me think it's possible to have a glorious day regardless of what's going on.
Well, you had breakfast with the Dalai Lama, so talk to listeners about that and tell us about what you learned in that experience.
Thanks for that, Curtis. I don't look good in this story, but I did write it. Back when I was in college, I was the editor of my college newspaper, and I got invited, I think, because I was the editor, to have breakfast with the head of the religion department, this Buddhist monk, and an interpreter. And I couldn't even pronounce the monk's name. It was Dalai, so, Lama. And so I showed this to my news editor, who is much smarter than me. A super smart guy. He's a leading geneticist today. Uh, and Stan said, "That's the Dalai Lama. You have to go." And I said, "Why?" And he said, "Oh, he's this really famous monk." Now, he wasn't, I have to my not too much discredit. He wasn't that famous at the time. The CIA had only recently extracted him from Nepal, where, the Chinese were taking over Nepal, and a lot of his followers were being persecuted. And so he had pretty much just escaped and was doing a national tour to raise money for the Nepalese and his followers. So um, I Stan said I had to go, so I went. And at breakfast, I met this guy. He had these, was wearing the robes and these really nerdy looking glasses, and he giggled the whole time. Now he may have been laughing at me, this clueless kid who had no idea why he was there. And but on the other hand, since then I've talked to people who understand Buddhism much more than I do, and they said, monks often do laugh a lot. They have that attitude toward life. They are able to achieve happiness in the worst of times. And you think of what this guy had gone through and what he was seeing, and still being able to laugh at breakfast with this idiot editor from, a college newspaper. Since then, I've realized that the guy, there's a reason why we kind of revere the guy. Anyway, Stan had said the reason I went to breakfast is that some people think he's a god, and I wanted to see what a god would eat for breakfast. It was like I don't remember him eating anything actually. I don't blame him. The food was terrible back then. But years later, I was before I kind of realized who he was, I just completely forgot about the guy. I wrote in the paper after breakfast like one paragraph saying monk visits our college. Well, I was working in Washington, D.C. as a journalist and magazine editor, and a member of the staff said excitedly, "Hey, the Dalai Lama is coming to Washington. You going to go?" This woman said to someone else on staff. And I overheard this and I said without thinking, "Oh, I had breakfast with that guy." Dead silence. Like everybody turns to me and I got nothing. I couldn't even remember what the guy said at breakfast. One of my more embarrassing moments out of many. And from then on, I've thought more about the Dalai Lama, if only because, I had these two moments of idiocy that I felt I had to correct for. And the interesting about this in terms of my own wheelhouse here, which is rhetoric and, particularly the ancient Greek philosophers, there is a Greek Western philosophy that's really closely aligned with Buddhism. And, Buddhism, as you know, is really hot right now among Americans for a lot of really good reasons. Well, there was a branch of Greek philosophy called Epicureanism, which doesn't have to do with eating great meals, by the way. It's really been misnamed. But Epicureans believed, um, unlike their rivals at the same time, the Stoics, that the purpose of life is happiness. And there are ways to achieve happiness that are really closely related to what Buddhists follow. In other words, you can be an Epicurean and still laugh at breakfast. And so I consider myself now an Epicurean because I've closely, read what the Epicureans talked about. And I try to practice this, myself, which basically has to do with living the kind of life that you're going to regret as little as possible, with the idea that if you can live well, you can be happy and help make other people happier as well. So it doesn't conflict with Stoicism exactly, but Stoicism is all about living the virtuous life and dismissing the bad things that you can control your thoughts over. Epicureans are a little different. It's more like how you live and moment by moment how you can live as happily as possible. And that led to all kinds of followers among the American founders, including Thomas Jefferson, who called himself an Epicurean and believed that great leaders in a republic would create the most happiness for the most people over the longest time, which I think Buddhists would probably agree with, and Epicureans definitely do. So, I think that any good self-help book should have a bit of stoicism in it and a lot of Epicureanism because people read books in order to be happier.
Speaking of books, talk to the listeners about your books. Tell us what we can expect when we read them and where we can get them.
Well, I mean, it depends on how you want to begin and what what you want. So if you want to learn rhetoric, if you want to learn the power of words, there are two ways to do that. There's an easy way, and there's the best-selling way. In other words, I've had one book that's a bestseller and other books that have been bestsellers in other countries, but not here. So the easy way is a book called How to Argue with a Cat, um, which has to do with all the ways to persuade that don't specifically have to do with words, because cats have a limited vocabulary. Now, why cats? First of all, I'm a cat lover. I grew up with dogs and love them too, but dogs are rhetorically uninteresting in the sense that they already want to do what you want them to do. Like they just want to serve. Whereas cats are like, what's in it for me? And that makes them rhetorically interesting because you have to persuade a cat. Cats, on the other hand, are also very highly persuasive themselves. And the way they do that, you can learn a lot. So that's why I wrote a book with hilarious illustrations by a friend who's a great artist of cats. The more complicated way, which is my best-selling book, is called Thank You for Arguing. You mentioned that. Thank you. Um, and that is kind of like a fun course in rhetoric that leads through the ways that you can be more persuasive in your life. I also wrote a book called Word Hero, which tells how to be wittier using these figures of speech and tropes and things like that. And then finally, my most recent book is Aristotle's Guide to Self-Persuasion, which applies all the stuff from my previous books into persuading yourself. But all through this, what ties all these together is these are all about the power of words and how you can use them for good, including for your own good.
Well, tell us about any upcoming projects that you're working on that listeners need to be aware of.
Well, I'm I'm now experimenting on this book about how to think like an editor. So I've spent a career as an editor, but I also one of my great heroes, who I think is not appreciated enough in these times, is Benjamin Franklin. And people remember Franklin, if they remember him at all, as a scientist. The guy who discovered electricity, though he didn't. I mean, he sort of showed how to capture it. He was this great diplomat who brought France into the revolution, which is how we ended up getting independence. And he did a bunch of interesting things, and he wrote all these, sayings that we still use. But really, at heart, he was an editor, and he thought as an editor. And so he became this hugely successful businessman right in the beginning. And then he ended up founding the first lending library, created the first volunteer fire department. He edited all our major American documents, including the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. He edited them. He didn't write them. So he also remade foreign policy, but throughout it all, he did it the way an editor would, which has to do with revision and not completely starting over, and the idea that there's always a deadline for everything. So now, what does this have to do with my beat rhetoric? I think it has a lot to do with it because, again, editing is mastering the power of words, applying a kind of grammar, a set of rules to your own life. And if you can think like Benjamin Franklin, maybe we can achieve some portion of what that great man was able to achieve. And by the way, he was one of the happiest people ever lived. I mean, he was a true Epicurean, in other words, living the good life and accomplishing great things, and as a happy person.
Throw out your contact info so people can keep up with everything that you're up to.
I'm on the usual fine social media places that people hate to go to now, but I have a Substack newsletter. Whether you're into that or not, you can simply look up my name, Jay Heinrichs, on Substack, and I do a weekly newsletter about the power of words. That's probably the easiest way to find me. I also have websites. If you go to Heinrichs.com, you'll find posts and that sort of thing. But go to Substack. That's probably the easiest way.
All right, close us out with some final thoughts. Maybe if there was something I forgot to talk about that you would like to touch on, or any final thoughts you have for the listeners.
Oh, thanks for asking, Curtis. One thing that just a tip that people tell me works great. Can I give you two? There'll be two final thoughts. One is if you're uncomfortable in an argument, think what tense they're in. And this is true of people, if you're politicians or whatever, if you feel uncomfortable with what you're hearing, ask what tense it is. Is it in the past tense, which is all about blame or things that went wrong in the past? Is about the present tense, where name calling takes place. Present tense, as Aristotle said, is all about values, what's good and bad, who's good and who's bad, who's in your tribe, who's against it. Or is it in the future tense, where problems can be solved? Like, nothing bad has happened in the future. We shouldn't dread the future. We should make some choices to affect it. So that's the first, final final thing. The second is, before you talk to anybody, tell yourself you're going to love them. I feel this to be more and more important. This isn't about empathy. It's really about, which is hard to do. It's really about telling yourself you're going to find ways to love people. And the older I get, I'm a privileged 70-year-old white guy. That my clients are younger than my children. I speak to more and more diverse crowds in high schools and colleges. How am I possibly going to think that I'm one of them? Well, I don't try anymore. I simply say I'm going to love them, and I generally do. I mean, the more I do this, the better. I actually tell clients when they go into meetings, especially if they're trying to win venture capital, I say, send love beams out of your eyes. And most of them think I've just been chewing some interesting gummy or something. And the few who actually listen come back and say, this was amazing. We got the love right back. And I don't mean to make this as like the great moral to the story here, but I'll tell you what, feeling the love and expressing it actually works.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, for more information on everything that Jay's up to, visit jheinrichs.com. Check out his books and, definitely learn the art of persuasion and keep sending those love beams. They definitely help. Please be sure to follow, rate, review, share this episode to as many people as possible. Go to www.curveball337.com for more information on the show. Share the website and the show to everybody you know. If you haven't done so, sign up for the newsletter and please drop us a line and leave us a review. Thank you for listening and supporting the show. And Jay, thank you for all that you do, and thank you for joining me.
Curtis, thank you. You do such good work. It's an honor to be here.
For more information on the Living the Dream with Curveball podcast, visit www.curveball337.com. Until next time, keep living the dream.